So, welcome to the Museum of Flight. My name is Tom Allan. I'm a docent here at the museum. I've been a docent for the last 6 years. And so my tour today is going to be on several airplanes we have in our great gallery that were very important to the World War II effort. We do have, over in the personal courage wing, World War II fighters, but these airplanes in our great gallery that were important to the war aren't fighters. They did other functions. So we'll talk about that when we go in there. But before we do, I'd like to give you a short introduction to our museum. We're standing in our lobby where we have some wonderful exhibits about early aviation, including gliders that were used to train pilots on how to fly and how to build airplanes. A very early German aircraft up above, it's called the Rumpler Taube. It's a replica or reproduction. That's basically the airplane the Germans had at the outbreak of World War I. More than half their airplanes were Taubes, just like that, and they were used for observation. A problem the Germans had with it, it was a very stable airplane, and which meant it didn't maneuver very well, and when they started putting guns on airplanes, it couldn't get out of its own way, so it very quickly became a training airplane at the rear. We have over next door our Red Barn. That is Boeing's very first factory building. It was acquired by Mr. Boeing in 1910 when he was having a yacht built. The yacht builder, a man by the name of Edward Heath, was a very well-known and regarded yacht builder, but not a good businessman. So he was going broke. Boeing wanted his yacht, so he bought out the shipyard for $10, paid off Heath's debts, and said, "Finish my yacht," which he did. So in 1917, when Boeing got his first contract to build airplanes, he had the shipyard building, and he got a contract from the Navy to build a trainer to be used for training pilots for World War I. So that's the building that they were built in. It was on the river, the Duwamish River across the street, a couple miles down towards Seattle. Worked out just fine because the plane was on floats. There was no runway there. Later on, when the airplanes were moved from floats to wheels, that became a huge problem. So Mr. Boeing went to the city fathers in about 1928 and said, "Build me an airport or I'm moving to California." That's when Boeing Field outside here was built, so to keep him in the state. So on the other side of the Red Barn, we have our personal courage wing, where we have World War II fighters downstairs and World War I fighters upstairs. A lot of people think that's probably our best exhibit in the whole area. It started out from the Champlin collection, which was down in Tucson in the 1990s. The museum acquired that collection, built the personal courage wing to house it and show it. They did a really terrific job. This is what we call our East Campus. Over on the other side of East Marginal Way, we have our West Campus. And over there, we have the Charles Simonyi Space Gallery. Over on this side, we have right now Destination Moon, which is an exhibit about the Apollo 11 landing, which occurred 50 years ago. In fact, this is July 17th. So 50 years ago, Apollo 11 was on its way to the moon. And on this Saturday, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the landing. But we have the actual command module on display back there, the Apollo 11 command module. It's on loan from the Smithsonian. It's normally on display at the Smithsonian, but this year the Smithsonian's undergoing a renovation. They're redoing their exhibit on space. They put it on tour. They asked our museum first when we'd like to have it, and we said on the 50th anniversary, so we have it this summer. A lot of other great exhibits, including a prototype of the moon buggy are back there, and it's just a wonderful exhibit. We have actually an F-1 engine, one of the 5 engines that was on the first stage of the Saturn V rocket. Huge thing, 18,000 pounds, probably 20 feet tall or so, developed 1.5 million pounds of thrust at takeoff. There were 5 of them at the bottom of that Saturn V, so that was 7.5 million pounds of thrust to lift 6.2 million pounds of weight off the surface of the Earth. All that's on display there, but unfortunately, the Smithsonian said we had to charge an extra surcharge to go in to see it, so that's not part of the museum exhibit. But across the street, we have the Simonyi Space Gallery, which represents space flight after Apollo. So we have the full fuselage trainer for the space shuttle over there, which you can get in. You can actually get into the cockpit, you can get into the payload bay. And we have a Soyuz space capsule that actually flew to the International Space Station and back. One of the few space artifacts that we had that actually went to space and came back. And then next to the Simone Space Gallery is our aviation pavilion. It's about 3.5 acres of very large airplanes, including a British Airways Concorde. You can walk through that one. The very first 707 Air Force One that was purchased during the Eisenhower administration. You can walk through that one. We have the very first 747 over there. You can walk through that. And to me, that's very interesting because there's no walls on the inside of the cabin. It's basically a flight test airplane. So you can basically see what's behind the curtain, all the control cables, all the ducting and plumbing that you normally don't see on a commercial airliner, and all that test instrumentation they had on board to test the airplane. We also have the first 727 that you can walk through, and we have a 787 Dreamliner. It was one of the flight test aircraft that they could not bring up to standard to deliver to an airline, so we got it. And it's a very interesting airplane to walk through if you've never been on a Dreamliner. We also have a B-17 over there, and on Saturdays we have a docent, or he's not a docent, but a volunteer who actually flew B-17s in World War II. This man is in his 90s. As spry as he was when he was flying those airplanes, he can still hoist himself from the bottom up into the cabin. Terrific guy, tells terrific stories. So if you're here on a Saturday, go listen to him. We have a B-29, a B-47, and several Navy aircraft, including an F-14 and an EA-6B, an A-6, an A-4, which is painted in Blue Angel colors. And outside the Great Gallery, we have an F-18, Blue Angel F-18 on a pedestal to announce your arrival here at the museum. So that's the introduction to our museum. I hope someday that you can come and enjoy it all. Give yourself several days if you do, though. So again, my tour today is going to be on some airplanes that are important to World War II, one of which was considered to be so important by General Eisenhower, who was the general in charge of the D-Day operations, in charge of the whole European theater, actually. He said, without this airplane, we might have lost the war. So let's go talk about it. So the airplane, of course, that Eisenhower considered so important to the war effort is the DC-3 that we have hanging from the ceiling. Its nomenclature in the military was the C-47, sometimes called the Goonie Bird, sometimes called the Dakota. I'm sure there were other names the soldiers used for it. It never dropped a bomb during World War II that I know of, never shot down another airplane, but it carried the freight, it carried the paratroopers on D-Day, it towed the gliders that on D-Day and Market Garden, Operation Market Garden. It carried the wounded back from the battlefield, back to hospitals. It carried supplies, and Eisenhower considered that so important that he said, without that airplane, we might have lost the war. The history of how the airplane came to be is kind of interesting. In the 1930s, a lot of the commercial airliners were like our Model 80 over there. And some of them, they were tri-motors, they had 3 engines. Ours is a bi-wing, but the Ford tri-motor and the Fokker tri-motor were single-wing airplanes. And the Fokker was made of wood. And in 1931, there was an air crash that killed the most famous sports guy of the time, Knute Rockne. And people wanted to know, how did this happen? Well, the investigation revealed that the laminate wood that was used to build the wing, that the moisture was getting into and dissolved the glue. And the wing came apart in there, killing Knute Rockne. At about the same time, Boeing had started design of a brand new all-metal airplane. And it was considered to be the first of the all-metal airliners, or the first of the modern airliners, I should say. All-metal, no external support on the wings. The wings were full cantilever, which meant there were no external supports to keep the wing attached to the fuselage. Landing gear retracted, and it had, for the first time, controllable pitch propellers, which was very important as the speed started to go up and the airplanes became more efficient. Well, Boeing was building that for his own airline. Boeing had an airline, you may not know it, but it was called United Airlines. And you can see that on the side of our Model 80 over there. You can see United Airlines. Well, TWA, who owned the Fokker that Knute Rockne was killed in, wanted to get all-metal airplanes. So they came to Boeing and said, we'd like to buy your Model 247. And Boeing said, well, you're going to have to wait till I build 75 for my own airline. So it's going to be several years. Well, TWA could not wait, so they went to Mr. Douglas down in California, and he designed the DC-1. It was a 12-seat airplane, looks pretty much like our DC-3, but a little smaller. It held 12 people. TWA said, that's a great airplane, but we want 14 seats. So there was only one DC-1 made, but the DC-2 came out with 14 seats, and more than 500 of those were built before the war. A little later on, American Airlines came by and said, we love that DC-2, but a lot of our flights are through the night, and we'd like to put sleeper seats on it. Can you build a larger airplane? And that's when they built the DC-3. And all that came about because Boeing refused to sell some airplanes to TWA in the early 1930s. But this DC-3 is considered to be one of the most important airplanes, even in the commercial world, because it was the first airliner that could make money by carrying passengers without being subsidized by the airlines. And so there were about 500 of them made commercially, and more than 10,000 were made for the military for World War II. And a lot of the DC-3s are still flying around the world today. I was in Berlin recently and saw one flying above Berlin on taking tourist on rides. But you'll find them down in South America and other parts of the world. Sometimes you still see them here in the U.S. But very rugged airplane, and it's considered to be one of the most important airplanes ever made. Eisenhower listed 5 things that he thought were very, very important to the war effort, any one of which, had he not had, we might have lost the war. One was the Jeep, another was a bazooka, the Higgins landing boat was one. He listed the atomic bomb. I would argue with him on that one, and he listed the DC-3. So let's go talk about a few more airplanes. Okay, the next airplane I want to talk about is our blue and the yellow airplane up above my head there. That's the Boeing Stearman. Lloyd Stearman had been a designer of airplanes in the 1920s, and in 1928, he got the idea of going to California, Los Angeles, to build airplanes for the movie industry and started his own aircraft firm. Well, that idea didn't work out very well, and he eventually moved his company to Wichita, Kansas, just in time for the big depression here in the U.S. So he was going broke. Boeing bought him out. Stearman eventually left the company and had really nothing to do with the design of this airplane. But even today, it's known as the Stearman because it was built by the Stearman Company. The importance of this airplane to the war is it trained almost every pilot that had to learn how to fly, who fought in World War II, flew in World War II, learned how to fly in this airplane. And some people, when it was flown by the Army Air Corps, it had the coloring you see on this airplane. When it was flown by the Navy, it was all yellow, and for that reason they call it the Yellow Peril, because a lot of accidents occurred in that airplane. But the airplane was used long after the war and still being used today as a crop duster to give rides. It's a tandem-seater, open cockpit airplane using a radial engine. Kind of an interesting story from my father-in-law. My father-in-law was a dive bomber pilot for the Navy in World War II. And when I first met him, I asked him what airplane did he learn how to fly in, and he told me a Stearman. Well, after he died, I inherited his logbook and looked in it. He never flew a Stearman, ever, according to the logbook. He flew an airplane called the N3N, which looked an awful lot like this airplane, but the N3N was built by the Naval Air Factory in Philadelphia, designed and built there. So I'm not sure whether he was confused or whether Stearman just became a generic term for the trainer airplane that they were using for the war. I suspect the latter is true. But at any rate, almost all the Army Air Corps pilots learned how to fly in a Stearman just like that one. And a good percentage of the Navy pilots learned how to fly in the Stearman. The other percentage learned how to fly in an N3N. Now over here we have 2 more airplanes. We have a green one up there called the Aranca. I think that's the L3, and Piper Cub over there, which when it was painted green was the L4. These were called Liaison Aircraft during the war. They were built by Piper, by Aranca, by Standard, by Taylorcraft. There were a bunch of them built. They were all based upon general aviation airplanes built before the war. And they were called Liaison because they were used primarily on the battlefront to carry messages from one side of the battlefield to the other, from one general to another, maybe to carry a wounded soldier back from the battlefield. And they were all called grasshoppers. And that happened here in the United States. The Army was running some drills. A message was sent from Texas to Georgia to one of these drills in a Piper Cub. And when the pilot landed, he bounced on it wasn't a runway, it was just the field he landed on. That was one of the advantages of these airplanes. They didn't need a runway. They could land on a relatively level field. And he bounced along, and the general receiving the message called it a grasshopper. A few weeks later, he wanted something else sent from Texas to Georgia, so he asked for the grasshopper to return. And no one in Texas knew what he was talking about. And finally the pilot said, well, he called me a grasshopper last time I was up there. So that term stuck for all the Liaison aircraft, no matter who built them. The Aranca up there's slight differences. They put more windows in it than the general aviation airplane had. There's an interesting story about the Piper Cub. There was Major Taylor, I think he was based in Italy, who got tired of flying over the battlefield and looking down at all those German Panzer tanks down below him, not being able to do anything about it. So he got the idea of lashing 3 bazookas on each wing strut for a total of 6 bazookas, and got them wired into the cockpit so he could fire them. And he went out hunting German tanks, and he was very successful. I forget the number of tanks he actually destroyed and armored personnel carriers, but General Patton really appreciated him. A few months later, Major Carpenter was involved in a friendly fire incident when he was on a tank, not in an airplane, that killed a few U.S. soldiers. The general in charge of that wanted to court-martial him, and Patton said, "You're not touching my boys." So that's how much he thought of them. But these airplanes were also used in something called the civilian training program to train civilian pilots before and at the outbreak of the war. My father had a friend who was a pilot before the war. He stood 6 foot 8 inches, and he wanted to fly fighters in the war, and both the Army and the Navy said, "No, you're too tall." So he spent the war training pilots how to fly in a Piper Cub like the one we have up above. It's hard to imagine a 6 foot 8 pilot sitting in the back seat of that airplane, but that's what happened.
Maybe use the rudder pedals in the front.
He later became a captain at Pan American Airlines after the war. So at any rate, we have one more airplane to talk about on this tour, so it's a little bit of a walk, so if you follow me. I forgot about one airplane I need to talk about. Okay, the airplane I want to talk about is the Beech-18 up there. That too is very important from a training perspective. It was designed as basically an executive transporter, a small airliner before the war, and it was in competition with the silver airplane, the Lockheed Electra. This Electra is in the same configuration as the one flown by Amelia Earhart when she was lost over the Pacific. But these two airplanes, they look very similar. They both have a twin tail. They are tail draggers, and they have retractable landing gear. It's hard to tell one from the other, but they were in competition with one another before the war. But when the war broke out, the War Department went to Lockheed and said, "Stop building your Electras. We want you to concentrate on the P-38." And they went to Beechcraft and said, "You continue to build the Beech-18. We'll call it the C-45. It's a small cargo airplane." They also used it as a trainer. It was used to train the bombardiers who flew on the bombers in World War II. It was used to train the navigators who navigated the bombers. It was used to train the machine gunners who fired the machine guns from a bomber. And it was also used to give pilots who learned how to fly in our Stearman their first multi-engine experience. So it was very, very important to both the Navy and the Army Air Corps as a training airplane, as well as a cargo airplane. So now let's go talk about the last airplane, and that's the V-1 Buzz Bomb. Okay, our last aircraft on our World War II tour of the Great Gallery is the V-1 Buzz Bomb. It's really the first of the guided missiles, much like the cruise missiles that came along much later. It was very primitive. The idea was not new. The idea actually dates back to World War I when the gyroscope was first invented, and by Sperry. And they experimented with basically Curtiss Jenny. It was the Navy version of the Curtiss Jenny as an unmanned aircraft that could fly along based upon its gyros in a straight line. And when it got to its destination, and there's a little bit of a problem how you determine that, and I'll describe that in a minute for the V-1 buzz bomb, it would shut off its engine and dive down on its target, carrying explosives. It never was used in World War I, but it was tested and it worked pretty well. Well, the Germans took that idea and they incorporated something called a pulse jet engine. And right here you can see the heart of that pulse jet engine. It looks like a radiator, but what it is shutters inside the framework there. The air goes from that direction in this direction, and then you can see the fuel injectors here. So the air comes in, fuel's injected. The first time to ignite it, a spark plug is used to start the detonation. And from then on, it's automatic. You don't need the spark plug anymore. Just the residual heat from each explosion left over will reignite it again. But reignition occurs 50 times a second, 50 hertz. And so it had a unique sound. And it used the same fuel as a piston-powered fighter did. It was just aviation gas. It wasn't jet gas that we use today, kerosene. It was very, very inefficient. This little engine used fuel at the same rate as a Lancaster bomber, about 6 gallons a minute. So you can see in the airplane, it's not that large. It only held less than 100 gallons. So even though it flew very, very fast, over 400 miles per hour, it couldn't go very far. But they built it and they tested it. And the disadvantage of it is, again, it was guided by gyros and an altimeter. You had to point the thing. It was launched from a rail in exactly the direction you wanted it to go. And it took off and used the altimeter to decide when to level off and to level flight. And as it flew along, the little propeller out in front of it spun. And someone had to figure out how many revolutions of that propeller it would take to get to the target. And so before it took off, they set that count into a counter. Each revolution of that propeller decremented the counter by 1. And when it got to 0, it shut the engine off and forced the buzz bomb into a dive. When the people on the ground in England heard that, they knew bad things were about to happen when that buzzing sound stopped. The first flight, wartime flight, operational use of it occurred exactly 1 week after D-Day on June 13th, 1944. And they basically, in order to reach London, had to be launched from the coast of France or somewhere along the coast of either the Netherlands or France. But after D-Day, as the troops pushed the Germans back, pretty quickly the buzz bomb was out of range. And so then they turned them from England onto the lowlands, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, an area that had just been freed from the Nazi occupation. And they were used to bomb those cities, Antwerp and others. And then they tried to launch them from bombers, a Heinkel 111. But the problem there was getting the Heinkel aligned precisely in the direction the missile had to go, so that didn't work out very well. They built more than 30,000 of these. About 10,000 of those were launched towards England. Somewhere in the order of 6,000 people were killed by them. They were a terror weapon. V stands for, I'm having a memory lapse here, but basically it was vengeance. It was a vengeance weapon. The whole idea got started after the Brits resorted to night bombing early in the war, and that was carpet bombing basically civilians in German cities. And so Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Nazis, after they authorized these things, called them the vengeance weapon. And vengeance in German also starts with the V. So the V1 was the buzz bomb, the V2 was the rocket, and that rocket, which is Wernher von Braun's creation, became the cornerstone of our Mercury program, the Redstone rocket, which launched both Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom into suborbital flight. Redstone was basically an evolution of the V2 rocket. So at any rate, a lot of people were killed. They were meant to terrorize, not to hit targets of any sort. The British got very clever about announcing where these things were crashing. If they crashed on London, they said they crashed short of London in the press, and that caused the Germans to adjust the count on that propeller, so the ones that came later would fly over London and crash in the countryside beyond London. So The Germans didn't really have a good spy network in England at the time. They were totally dependent upon what was being published in the press and some double agents they had. And so basically the British could feed them any information they wanted as to where these things were landed. But still, a significant number of people were killed and wounded by these things. So that's the end of the World War II tour in the Great Gallery. I encourage you to come to the museum. Lots to do and lots to see here. So thank you for visiting.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, right.
Very good.
You wanna...
Very good. That's great. Well, I gave you the card.
Yeah.
So give me a couple of weeks, and I'm sure I'll get it up on YouTube.
All right. Where did I put that
My
thing? There it is.
ongoing museum tour. And I'll walk around and get some other stuff. But that's great, and that's it's a good duration because most of my stuff is way too long. So
Well, that's a 30-minute tour.